In this video, we are going to talk about proteins. So, what is a protein? Our idea of a protein in terms of nutrition and like dietary protein is kind of different from the idea of what a protein is or does in the body. So, proteins are actually a huge component of your body. So if you were to take your cells and evaporate all of the water out and you were to weigh what was left over, about half of the stuff in your cells that isn't water is protein. So huge component of your body. And proteins can serve lots and lots of functions in your body. So proteins, I'll show you some of the jobs that proteins can do in just a second, but I like to think of the cell as sort of a factory that makes things, breaks things down, it uses energy, it stores energy, things get moved from one end of the factory to the other. It's a very it's a place where a lot of stuff is going on and a lot of stuff is moving, and the proteins are kind of the machines in the factory that is your cell. So proteins are doing all of the different little jobs of like building and moving stuff, and proteins just, they do the jobs, is how I like to think of proteins. So here's one of the jobs that proteins do. Some proteins are called enzymes, and enzymes catalyze or speed up chemical reactions. So for example, if you were to eat something, you have digestive enzymes that would break down what you ate into smaller parts, and it would speed that process of breaking the food down up. Some proteins are involved in giving cells their kind of shape and their strength and helping them move from place to place. So that's the cytoskeleton, which we'll talk about a lot later. On the bottom in this image, you can see whatever this red protein is walking along, that's part of the cytoskeleton. So you can kind of think of that as like an I-beam that stretches from one end of the cell to the other, maybe. That motor protein, it's a motor protein because it can move and it can walk, and it has a bag of stuff attached to one end of it, and so it is dragging that bag of stuff from one end of the cell to the other, so pretty cool. Some proteins serve an immune function. So for example, antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins that your cells make, that some of your immune cells make, that are able to recognize like foreign invaders. So you might have heard about antibodies in relation to COVID-19 lately. If somebody has had COVID-19, then they will develop antibodies against the virus. And that helps the cells, it helps the body attack the virus. Some proteins help transport molecules from one part of the cell or one part of the body to another. So for example, this protein is a channel that allows water molecules across a membrane. Membranes are fatty, so the water doesn't want to go across, so you might have transport proteins that help things get in and out of the cell. Some proteins are storage proteins. So this example is ovalbumin, which is the protein in egg white. So a little chick growing up in an egg would have all that ovalbumin as a storage for, like that chick could break down the ovalbumin into the component parts of a protein and use it to build the proteins that the chick needs to grow. Some proteins, like insulin, for example, act as hormones. Hormones are molecules that travel from one part of the body to spread a message, basically. So insulin has to do with glucose metabolism, and it travels from your pancreas to your bloodstream and throughout the rest of the body. And so that's the hormone, is the messenger that travels around. And then some proteins act as receptors, which means that something like a hormone might bind to the receptor on the outside of the cell, and the receptor, so this bluish pair of molecules here, the receptor is able to transmit that signal across the cell membrane into the cell. And so the insulin doesn't enter the cell, it just binds to the receptor, and the receptor changes shape or something and has a way to tell the cell what to do in response to that signal. So in this case, it would tell the cell to do something different related to glucose. Some proteins, like keratin, serve a structural function in the body. So, keratin, for example, is in hair or horns, and it's made up of all of these long, skinny fibers that run parallel, and so it creates this long, skinny, strong hair. So those are some examples of the functions that proteins can serve in the body. So proteins are kind of a diverse group. They do a lot of different things. But what all proteins have in common is that they're all made up of amino acids. So amino acids are the subunits, and they're kind of strung together end to end to end. And all of the amino acids strung together make a protein. We'll talk about what an amino acid looks like in a second. But first, I want to talk about this idea of small subunits being strung together to make a long molecule. We're going to talk about this also with carbohydrates and nucleic acids. So these words, monomer and polymer, are not specific to proteins, but the idea is if something has small subunits that repeat, those are called monomers. If something is made up of a bunch of small subunits called monomers, then that thing is a polymer. So mono is one, poly is many. So in the case of proteins, the monomer is the amino acid, the polymer is a protein or possibly a peptide. Those words are really similar. I'm not going to worry about the difference right now. So polymers are built from monomers. And the nice thing about polymers built from monomers is that you can end up with a huge variety of molecules. So there are 20 different kinds of amino acids in our proteins. And imagine you were making a protein that was 100 amino acids long, and you could choose any of those 20 amino acids for the first spot, and any of those 20 for the second spot, and any of those 20 for the third spot. You imagine how many different combinations of proteins you could have when you have 100 amino acids and you just choose one at random, right? You could have a lot. So this structure of kind of, it's almost like an alphabet, you could build like an infinite number of novels out of the alphabet in the English language. It's a similar idea. You can make a ton of different proteins from these 20 amino acids. Also, even though we talk about amino acids being monomers, they don't always necessarily need to be built up into bigger molecules. So some amino acids have jobs on their own. For example, the amino acid glutamate is a neurotransmitter that sends signals in your brain. So what is an amino acid? Amino acids have an amino group on one end. That's what this looks like, NH2. They have the carboxyl group on the other end. That's COOH. And when you put it together, that's the amino group on the left here, the carboxyl group on the right. In the middle, there's a carbon we call the alpha carbon. And notice that hanging off one side of that carbon is a hydrogen, and hanging off the other side is the letter R, which stands for R group, or it's a side chain. So R is, unlike these other letters here, R is not an element. It's like a symbol that says, it's kind of a wild card symbol. Something else goes here. So all of the 20 amino acids have this same amino group, alpha carbon, hydrogen, and carboxyl group. The only place that they differ is this side chain, the R group. I know you can't see this very well, but this is a table of all the different amino acids. And I just want to point out, if you notice the part on top of each amino acid that isn't in the colored box, that's that common backbone with the amino group and the carboxyl group and the alpha carbon and the hydrogen. And then the part that is in the colored box is the R group. So those are different for each of these amino acids. And those R groups give different amino acids different properties. So some of them like water, some of them don't like water, some of them are positive, some of them are negative. But these are the 20 building blocks that we make our proteins out of. And when we talk about proteins, we talk about 4 levels of structure. So to start out with, a protein is a whole bunch of amino acids strung together end to end. And we call that the primary structure of the protein. So you can kind of think of it as like the sequence of the protein. In this case, we have the amino acid glycine stuck to proline, stuck to threonine, stuck to glycine, stuck to threonine, stuck to glycine. That's it. That's the primary structure. The The secondary structure is what happens when those amino acids start to interact with each other. So sometimes what will happen is parts of that long chain of amino acids will start to form these neat little curlicues. Those are called alpha helices. And sometimes what will happen is that that long chain will kind of zigzag back and forth and form this structure that we call a pleated sheet or a beta sheet. Notice that, so the purple ribbon is all the amino acids strung end to end, and then notice that those purple sheets are connected by dotted lines. So the force that holds these curlicues and these pleated sheets, sorry, the curlicues and the pleated sheets in place is the hydrogen bonds. So yeah, hydrogen bonds hold these structures together. And that's it. When you're thinking what is secondary structure? Alpha helices or beta sheets. When we talk about a protein's tertiary structure, so we already know the sequence, and we know that we've started to form some curlicues and we started to form some zigzags. The tertiary structure is like all of the other folds of that protein chain. So there are going to be parts that are like less organized. There are going to be parts that are different shapes just besides those two shapes. But the tertiary structure is kind of like the three-dimensional shape of the protein sort of after all of that folding is done. So our protein doesn't end up as a long skinny strand. It ends up as like a ball, a folded up ball of string, kind of. And then there's one more layer we talk about, which is quaternary structure. Quaternary meaning like the fourth level of structure. And that just means, does this protein have multiple subunits? Like, do sort of multiple proteins come together to make one functional unit? Like, are there many parts in this machine that work together? And so that's the idea of quaternary structure. So on the left in collagen, which looks kind of like the keratin we saw before, each of those blue strands is an independent like protein chain. And so when all of them wrap around together, so now we have multiple peptides or multiple proteins interacting with each other to make like one functional piece of collagen, then that's when we have quaternary structure. On the right, this is an example of hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in your blood. So it has alpha subunits and beta subunits. So it's got 4 different subunits that come together to make this one molecule that carries oxygen in your blood. So it has quaternary structure. So not all proteins have quaternary structure because not all proteins are made up of multiple subunits, but all proteins have primary, secondary, and tertiary structure. Okay, that's proteins. We will continue to touch on a lot of the concepts of this video as we go into the different parts of the cell. But for now, try to learn the structure of an amino acid and just learn what the idea of a polymer and a monomer, and kind of get a broad sense of what proteins do in the cell. I don't expect you to memorize every example. I just want you to like understand broadly what a protein is, and we'll get into specific examples later on as we go.